The worst part wasn't the screaming. It was the way the screaming stopped exactly 47 seconds after they sealed the conversion bay doors, like someone had thrown a switch. I counted every time. The smell came 3 minutes later, burnt sugar and rendered fat, seeping through ventilation grills that were never designed to filter anything organic. Nobody told us what the grills were for when we arrived. Nobody told us much of anything. I was a cargo supervisor before this. 16 years shuffling manifests on Hive Tertius, tracking grain shipments and counting bolt crates until my eyes bled from the data slate glare. Middle management, invisible, the kind of functionary the administratum forgets exists until a quota goes unfilled. When the recruitment sermons started echoing through the ventilation stacks, when the preachers in their oil-stained vestments began promising salvation through service, I didn't think they meant me. I was 43. My back seized up every morning. I had a fungal infection in my left boot that medicals said would cost more to treat than to simply let fester. I wasn't soldier material. I wasn't even good laborer material anymore. But they didn't ask for soldiers, they asked for supervisors, people who could read, people who understood logistics, people who knew how to process throughput and maintain schedules. The preacher who came to my hab block spoke in a voice like grinding gears, his augmetic jaw clicking with each syllable. He said the Forge complex needed administrators. He said the Imperium required men of organizational talent. He said we would be serving the God Emperor's holy work in the most direct way possible, facilitating the great machinery of salvation itself. He never said what we'd be administering. He never said what the machinery would be fed. The transit took 4 months. 47 of us packed into a bulk hauler's crew quarters, sleeping in shifts because there weren't enough bunks. We played cards with greasy deck someone had smuggled aboard. We told ourselves stories about what awaited us, clean offices maybe, or at least predictable work. Anything was better than the Hive. Anything was better than watching your children's teeth fall out from malnutrition while you filed reports about grain rot. A woman named Kessa, who'd worked textiles, said her sister had gone to a Forge world and sent back 3 months' wages in a single transfer. We held on to that. We made it mean something. The Forge complex appeared in the viewport like a tumor growing on the planet's surface. No green, no blue, just gray-brown expanses of industrial sprawl stretching beyond the horizon, broken by cooling towers that belched ash into a sky the color of old bruises. The air tasted like metal before we even disembarked. The transport tech, half his face replaced with bolted plating, told us not to breathe deep, said the particulate count would scar our lungs inside a week, said we'd get used to it, or we wouldn't, and either way it didn't matter because the work needed doing. They separated us immediately, men to one processing bay, women to another. I never saw Kessa again. I tried asking once, 3 days in, and the overseer, a massive bulk of a man whose flesh seemed to be melting into the environmental suit he wore, told me that questions were inefficient, that efficiency was holiness, that I would learn to stop wondering, or I would learn nothing at all. He smelled like formaldehyde and burning hair. His eyes were the color of spoiled milk. Our barracks were converted storage units stacked 4 high, each one barely wide enough to lie down in. The walls sweated condensation that tasted of copper. 32 bunks for 47 men, so we rotated in shifts, sleeping in beds still warm from the last occupant. The heating cycled on and off without pattern, freezing us 1 hour and baking us the next. At night, though there was no real night, just the dimming of overhead lumens on a timer, you could hear things moving in the walls, scratching, whispering. One man, Dalton, swore he heard his name being called from inside the ventilation shaft. He spent 3 hours with his ear pressed against the grill, weeping softly, until 2 overseers dragged him away. His bunk stayed empty for half a shift, then someone new was sleeping in it. Nobody asked where Dalton went. We were learning efficiency. The orientation was 8 hours of standing in a freezing assembly hall, while a tech priest whose voice came from a speaker embedded in his chest explained our function. He never moved his mouth. I'm not sure he had a mouth anymore, just a smooth oval of scar tissue where a face should have been. He told us we were blessed, told us we would serve the Omnissiah's will by facilitating the sacred work of flesh engineering, that the Imperium's war machine required constant feeding, that the conversion quotas were holy mandates, and our role was to ensure throughput remained optimal. He projected images on the wall behind him, schematics, diagrams. I didn't understand them at first. My mind kept sliding off the shapes, refusing to assemble them into meaning. Then I saw the proportions, the measurement labels, the input-output ratios. They weren't machine parts, they were anatomical cross-sections, human anatomical cross-sections, with industrial fittings where joints should be, with pressure ratings where organs should be. The man next to me vomited. The tech priest paused exactly 1 second, then continued. The vomit pooled around our boots. Nobody moved to clean it. Our duties were simple. We received shipments. We processed intake forms. We verified identity markers against manifest lists. We ensured the cargo reached the conversion bays on schedule. The cargo arrived in bulk transports 3 times per cycle. Massive containers marked only with serial numbers and weight classifications. Standard procedure: crack the seals, confirm the count, log the transfer, send them forward. Just like grain shipments. Just like bolt crates. Except grain shipments didn't whimper when the containers shifted during unloading. I processed my first container on my second day. The seal broke with a hiss of pressurized air, cold and stinking of unwashed bodies. Inside were people. 63 of them, packed standing room only, swaying together as the container tilted on its loader tracks. They blinked in the sudden light like cave-dwelling things. Children, elderly, a pregnant woman clutching her belly. All of them wearing the same grey smocks, all of them staring with the same empty incomprehension. A boy, maybe 8, looked directly at me. His lips formed a word I couldn't hear over the machinery. The overseer slapped a data slate into my hands. "Count and verify," he said. "Throughput waits for no one." I counted 63. I verified, all present. I logged the transfer. I sent them forward. The doors sealed behind them with a pneumatic thunk that I can still hear when I close my eyes. 47 seconds later, the screaming stopped. 3 minutes after that, the smell began. That was the routine. 3 times per cycle, every cycle, for months. The containers arrived. We processed them. They went forward. The smell came back. We filed reports documenting successful transfer. We maintained throughput. We were efficient. We were holy. You learn not to look at faces. That's the first skill you develop. Eyes go to the manifest, to the data slate, to the serial numbers stenciled on container walls. Never to the cargo. Faces have expressions. Faces ask questions. Faces make you remember that you were them once, standing in a processing line, being told you were needed, being told you were serving. You can't afford to remember that and still do the work, so you stop looking. But you can't stop hearing. The containers aren't soundproofed. During transport, while we're guiding them through the corridors toward the conversion bays, you hear everything. Prayers, pleading, sometimes singing, children's songs, creche rhymes, the kind of thing you'd hear in a hive school. Once someone inside was reciting imperial litanies, their voice steady and faithful, certain that devotion would be rewarded. The overseer escorting that shipment laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, it was worse. It was genuine amusement, like someone had told him an old joke he'd heard 1,000 times. "They always think that helps," he said, his augmetic vocal grill buzzing. "They always think someone's listening." After 3 weeks, a man named Torrens refused. He was processing a container same as any other, but when the seal cracked, he just stood there, data slate hanging limp in his hand. He was staring at something inside. I couldn't see what. I didn't want to see what. The overseer gave him 10 seconds, then pulled Torrens aside and activated his shock collar. Torrens seized, foam bubbling from his mouth, his eyes rolling back to show the whites. When it stopped, the overseer asked if he was ready to resume his duties. Torrens nodded, Torrens counted, Torrens verified, Torrens logged the transfer. But that night in the barracks, Torrens hung himself from the support beam using his own belt. They left his body there until morning shift change, then cut him down and dragged him away. Someone new was sleeping in his bunk before the day cycle ended. The shock collars were a surprise. They fitted them during our second week, told us they were motivational compliance devices that would help us maintain focus during difficult periods. They looked like industrial clasps, cold metal locked around your throat, a blinking red diode where your jugular pulsed. The overseers carried activators on their belts like they were nothing, like they were keyring ornaments. I saw them used 6 times in the first month. The smell of burnt flesh never quite faded from the assembly areas where it happened. After Torrens, nobody refused. We had learned efficiency. The conversion bays themselves were off limits. We never went past the input doors, never saw what happened inside. But you could hear the machinery, massive rhythmic pounding that shook dust from the ceiling fixtures, hydraulic screams, the whine of industrial saws cycling up to speed, and underneath it all, for exactly 47 seconds, the other sounds, the human sounds, then silence. Then the ventilation grills would rattle and that smell would come seeping through, burnt sugar and rendered fat and something else, something chemical and wrong, that coated your sinuses and stayed there for hours. I asked once early on what they were making in there. The question just slipped out during a loading procedure. The tech priest supervising us turned his smooth, mouthless face toward me, and I felt something probe my thoughts. Not psychic, not mystical, just the weight of his attention through whatever sensors had replaced his eyes. He didn't answer. He just watched me for 15 seconds that felt like 15 hours, then returned to his data logging. But that night, 2 overseers came to my bunk and took me to a side chamber I hadn't known existed. The room was small and cold and smelled like disinfectant failing to cover something worse. They strapped me to a chair, just precautionary, they said, and played a recording. A vid feed from inside one of the conversion bays. I won't describe what I saw. I can't. My mind still fragments when I try to assemble the images into coherent memory. Bodies opened like machinery, flesh restructured around industrial components. Screaming that didn't stop when it should have because they'd done something to the throats, something to keep them conscious and functional, even as they were unmade and remade into, I vomited until there was nothing left, then vomited bile, then dry heaved until my ribs creaked. The overseers waited patiently. When I finally stopped, they unstrapped me and escorted me back to barracks. No punishment, no shock collar, just a lesson, just efficiency. Now you know what you're serving, one of them said, his voice almost kind. Now you can't pretend. I processed 17 more shipments after that. I stopped counting faces. I stopped counting anything except container numbers and manifest totals. The boy who'd mouthed that word at me haunted my dreams, but dreams weren't real, and the work was. The work was holy. The work was necessary. The Imperium required flesh to feed the machinery of its survival, and we were the ones who kept that flesh flowing. Logistics, throughput, efficiency. These were the words we wrapped around ourselves like shrouds, the mantras that let us sleep in our still warm bunks and wake to do it again. But something was changing, subtle at first. The containers started arriving with different markings. Instead of bulk civilian transports, we began receiving specialized units marked with administratum seals, official designations, tithe classifications, legal documentation. I recognized some of the source codes from my old work. These weren't random conscriptions from underhives. These were targeted extractions, entire census blocks, documented populations of specific settlements. And the numbers were increasing. 3 shipments per cycle became 4, then 5. The conversion bays began operating around the clock, the machinery never stopping, the smell becoming so constant that you forgot what clean air tasted like. The overseers grew twitchy, aggressive, activating shock collars for minor infractions. Production quotas kept climbing. The tech priests held emergency assemblies where they preached about holy deadlines and sacred manufacturing targets. Something vast was approaching, something that required more flesh than we'd ever processed. Then they changed the manifest categories. We'd always logged cargo as bulk organic material or population transfer units, bureaucratic euphemisms that let us pretend we were moving resources, not people. But the new forms had a different classification, a single word printed in high Gothic that I had to look up in the data archive: voluntarii. Volunteers. I laughed when I read it, actually laughed sharp and bitter, until another supervisor grabbed my arm and hissed at me to shut up before an overseer heard. Volunteers. That's what the forms called them. Every container, every shipment, every child and elder and pregnant woman we sent into those bays was classified as having volunteered, having chosen this, having offered themselves willingly to the sacred work. We'd all volunteered. That's what they'd told us when we arrived. That's what I'd believed, standing in that hab block listening to the preacher with the augmetic jaw. I'd volunteered. I'd chosen this. And in choosing it, I'd made myself responsible. I'd made myself complicit. There was no one to blame but myself. That was the genius of it. That was the efficiency. Around the 4th month, people started disappearing from our barracks, not dead, not like Torrens or the handful of others who'd found ways to exit their service early. Just gone. Bunks would be empty one cycle, and when you asked, the overseers would say the missing men had been reassigned to specialized duties or elevated to higher service. Nobody believed it, but nobody asked twice. The shock collars saw to that. I noticed the pattern. The men who disappeared were the ones who'd stopped coping. The ones whose hands shook during manifest checks. The ones who'd started flinching every time a container seal broke. The ones who cried in their bunks when they thought everyone was asleep. They were becoming inefficient, and inefficiency was wasteful, and waste was heretical. I became very good at not shaking, at not flinching, at not crying, but I couldn't stop counting. 47 seconds, 3 minutes, every container, every shipment. The numbers were mantras now, prayers of their own kind. If I kept counting, I was still doing my job. If I was doing my job, I was being efficient. If I was being efficient, I wouldn't disappear. The logic was airtight. The logic was my only anchor. Then came the day the container arrived with my name on it, not literally, not my name specifically, but my census designation, my hab block code. The source identification on the manifest matched Hive Tertius, Sector Gamma 7, Block 449, where I'd lived for 16 years. Where I'd filed my cargo reports and counted bolt crates and watched my children's teeth fall out, where the preacher with the augmetic jaw had told me I was needed. I stood there holding the data slate, staring at those codes, and something inside me that had been carefully locked away began to crack. My hands didn't shake. I didn't flinch. I was efficient. I cracked the seal. I verified the count. 81 people. I recognized 12 of them, neighbors, a woman from my residential tier who'd always nodded good morning, a man who'd worked in the same administratum office 3 floors down. His son. The boy was 14, gap-toothed, the kind of kid who still smiled when you saw him in the corridors because nobody had beaten the hope out of him yet. He recognized me. I saw it in his eyes, relief flooding across his face like sunrise. He mouthed my name. He thought I was going to help. He thought seeing someone familiar meant salvation was coming. He thought, I logged the transfer, I verified the manifest, I sent them forward. 47 seconds later, the screaming stopped. 3 minutes after that, the smell came back. And I stood there with the data slate still in my hands, watching the empty space where the container had been, and I realized I hadn't felt anything. not horror, not grief, not even guilt, just the vague satisfaction of completed work, of maintained efficiency, of holy service rendered. I'd become what they needed, not a person, not a functionary, just a process, just a component in the machinery, as much a part of it as the conversion bays themselves. They'd fed me through a different kind of transformation, slower and subtler but no less complete. They'd rendered me down and rebuilt me into something that could do this work without breaking, without stopping, without even feeling. That night I tried to feel something, anything. I lay in my bunk, someone else's bunk, still warm from the previous occupant, and tried to summon grief for the boy with the gap-toothed smile. Tried to remember what horror felt like, but there was nothing, just emptiness, just the numbers circling in my head. 47 seconds, 3 minutes, 81 people, manifest verified, transfer complete, efficiency maintained. A man 2 bunks over was crying into his thin pillow, shoulders shaking, trying to muffle the sound. I felt annoyed. His emotional display was disruptive. It was interfering with my rest cycle. It was inefficient. I almost reported him to the overseers. Almost. Something vestigial, some last scrap of whatever I'd been before, stopped me. But it was getting smaller. Soon there wouldn't be anything left to stop me. Soon I'd be completely efficient. The shipments kept coming. The quotas kept rising. We processed 6 containers per cycle now, then 7. More staff arrived to help manage the throughput. Fresh supervisors with the same hollow optimism I'd carried 4 months ago, talking about service and duty and holy work. I watched them crack, watched the light go out of their eyes container by container, 47 seconds at a time, watched them become efficient. It usually took about 6 weeks. One woman lasted only 9 days before they dragged her away. A man lasted 3 months, right up until they brought a container from his home world. Then he became efficient too. We all did eventually. That was the point. I stopped sleeping in regular cycles. The dreams were becoming problematic, faces mostly, staring out from containers, mouthing names and questions and prayers I couldn't hear. I'd wake with that burnt sugar smell in my nostrils, even though the ventilation had been clean for hours. So I started taking double shifts, volunteering for extra duty, staying at the loading bays until exhaustion rendered me unconscious in my bunk for 3 or 4 hours before starting again. Work was easier than dreams. Work had purpose. Work was holy. The tech priest praised my dedication, said I was an example of proper devotion, said my efficiency ratings were exemplary. They gave me a commendation, a small brass pin stamped with a gear and skull design, something I was meant to wear proudly. I pinned it to my work smock. I felt nothing. The pin was just another component. I was just another component. We were all just gears in the holy machinery, turning and turning and turning. Then the announcement came. Assembly in the main bay, all supervisory staff, mandatory attendance. We stood in our rows, maybe 200 of us now. I didn't recognize half of them anymore. Fresh meat brought in to handle the increased quotas. The tech priest with the speaker chest addressed us, his voice booming through the chamber with mechanical authority. The sacred work was expanding. The Imperium's needs had grown beyond current capacity. New conversion bays were being constructed. New production lines were being initiated. And to facilitate this glorious expansion, new administrative staff would be required. Staff with experience, staff who understood the holy nature of throughput, staff who had proven themselves efficient. We were being promoted. A murmur rippled through the assembly. Promotion meant better quarters, better rations, less direct exposure to the processing work. It meant survival. It meant reward for faithful service. Several men around me straightened up, something like hope flickering in their dead eyes. The tech priest continued. Our new duties would involve direct oversight of conversion operations. We would be working inside the bays themselves, managing the machinery, ensuring optimal performance, maintaining the equipment. Technical training would be provided. Augmentation would be available for those who requested it. or required it. Our service to the Omnissiah would deepen. Our efficiency would reach new heights of holiness, and we would of course be fitted with specialized neural implants to help us perform these duties without psychological interference. Simple procedure, minimal discomfort, necessary for the work. The implants would help us maintain focus during the more challenging aspects of Bay operation, would help us see the sacred patterns in the work, would help us understand that the screaming wasn't suffering, it was transformation, it was holy, it was necessary. They were going to finish what they'd started. They were going to complete our conversion, not flesh into machinery like the cargo we processed, but something else, something that could stand in those bays day after day and not just endure but embrace it. They were going to cut away whatever remained of our humanity and replace it with pure, perfect efficiency. I looked around the assembly hall, at the 200 faces dead-eyed and hollow, at the overseers with their shock collar activators, at the tech priest with his smooth, mouthless face, at the massive industrial doors leading to the conversion bays, still stained with substances I'd learned not to identify, and I realized I was going to accept, I was going to volunteer, because I'd been volunteering all along. Every time I cracked a seal, every time I verified a manifest, every time I sent a container forward and counted the seconds until the screaming stopped, I'd been volunteering to become this, to become nothing, to become efficient. The worst part wasn't the realization, it was discovering I didn't care. They separated us into groups for processing, alphabetical by designation code. I ended up in the third batch scheduled for neural implantation in 2 cycles, 47 hours. Enough time to complete my current duty rotation, enough time to process 6 more containers, enough time to maintain throughput. I returned to the loading bays, I did my work, the containers arrived. I cracked the seals, I verified the counts, I sent them forward. 47 seconds, 3 minutes. The numbers were soothing, the numbers were prayer. A container arrived from Hive Tertius, Sector Gamma 7, Block 449 again. They'd gone back, they'd extracted more. This shipment was smaller, 32 people. I knew 16 of them, my former supervisor, 3 co-workers, a family from the HAB unit next to mine, and standing near the back, pressed against the container wall, trying to make herself small, my daughter. She was 19. I hadn't seen her in 4 months. She'd lost weight. Her hair was shorn close to her skull, marked with the administratum processing codes they stamped on tithed populations. She was wearing the same grey smock as the others. She was swaying with the movement of the container, eyes unfocused, probably drugged for transport. But when she saw me, something cleared. Recognition, then relief, then desperate, terrible hope. She said my name. I heard it this time. The loading bay was quieter than usual, some machinery cycling down for maintenance. Her voice carried across the space between us, thin and breaking. Dad. She said Dad. She thought seeing me meant salvation. She thought I could stop this. She thought I was still who I'd been, cargo supervisor, middle management, invisible functionary, but still her father. Still human. I looked at the data slate in my hands, at the manifest, at the verification protocols, at my duty, at the holy work, at efficiency. The overseer beside me shifted, hand moving toward the shock collar activator on his belt, not threatening, just ready, just waiting to see what I would do, testing my efficiency, testing whether I'd become what they needed, testing whether the conversion was complete. I looked at my daughter, at her thin face and shorn hair and desperate eyes, at the way she was mouthing my name over and over, pleading without words for me to be who I'd been, for me to remember, for me to choose her over efficiency, over the holy work, over throughput, and I realized I couldn't. Not because they'd stop me, not because of the shock collar or the overseers or the consequences, but because I'd forgotten how. Whatever mechanism in the human soul allows a father to choose his child over his duty had been carefully, systematically dismantled over 4 months of containers and manifest checks and burnt sugar smells. They'd rendered it down and rebuilt me without it. I was efficient, I was holy, I was useful. I verified the count, 32, all present. I logged a transfer. I authorized forward movement. The overseer nodded approval. The container began moving on its loader tracks toward the conversion bay doors. My daughter's mouth opened in a scream I couldn't hear over the machinery. Her hands pressed against the container walls. Her eyes stayed locked on mine, disbelief giving way to understanding, giving way to something I'd seen in 1,000 faces before. The realization that salvation wasn't coming, that there was no one listening, that this was holy, that this was necessary, that everyone was volunteering. The doors sealed, pneumatic thunk. I counted, 47 seconds. The screaming stopped, 3 minutes. The smell came seeping through the ventilation grills, burnt sugar and rendered fat, and something chemical and wrong. I stood there with the data slate in my hands, watching the closed doors, and I felt nothing, absolutely nothing. Just the vague satisfaction of maintained efficiency, of duty completed, of holy service rendered. The thing inside me that had been my daughter's father was gone, rendered down and processed like everything else that came through these bays. All that remained was the function, the throughput, the numbers. The overseer clapped me on the shoulder. "Exemplary," he said. "The omniseer sees your devotion." I filed my report. I moved to the next container. I cracked the seal. I verified the count. I sent them forward. 47 seconds. 3 minutes. The cycle continued. The work continued. I continued, or whatever was left wearing my designation code continued, moving through the motions of function like machinery that had forgotten it was ever anything else. 2 cycles later, they took me for neural implantation. The procedure was quick and professional. They strapped me to a surgical chair in a sterile white room that smelled like disinfectant and burnt metal. A tech priest with 6 arms and no face began the work, drilling into my skull with precision that spoke of thousands of identical procedures. I felt pressure, then cold, then something worming its way into my brain tissue, metal tendrils spreading through neural pathways like roots seeking water. The tech priest explained what he was doing in a calm, educational tone. The implant would optimize my cognitive function for bay oversight, would filter unnecessary emotional responses that interfered with holy work, would help me see the sacred patterns in flesh-to-machinery conversion, would let me understand that transformation wasn't destruction, it was apotheosis, mortal flesh achieving divine purpose, weakness becoming strength, humanity becoming utility. I watched his 6 arms work through my reflection in the polished metal ceiling, watched him peel back sections of my scalp and socket data ports into my skull, watched my face remain utterly calm throughout, no fear, no horror, no resistance, just acceptance, just efficiency. When it was done, he activated the implant. The world changed, not drastically, subtly. Colors shifted slightly cooler, sounds gained new harmonics, smells passed themselves into chemical components my mind could now identify and categorize. But the biggest change was internal. The vestigial scraps of grief and guilt that had been rattling around my consciousness went quiet, not suppressed, erased. The implant had reached into my neural architecture and deleted the parts that still remembered being human. I was perfected, I was efficient, I was holy. They assigned me to Conversion Bay 7. My duties were simple: monitor the machinery, ensure optimal performance, maintain the production line. The work was physically easier than cargo supervision, climate-controlled environment, ergonomic workstations, regular maintenance schedules. And with the implant, the screaming didn't bother me anymore. I understood it now. The machinery wasn't torturing, it was transforming. The sounds weren't suffering, they were transcendence. Each body that entered the bay as frightened flesh left as sanctified component, ready to serve the Imperium's holy war, ready to fulfill its divine purpose. I watched it happen hundreds of times, thousands. The bodies on the input conveyor, still breathing, still conscious, that was important. Consciousness preserved the neural pathways that made them compatible with certain augmetic systems, the machinery opening them with surgical precision, the industrial components sliding into place where organs had been, the bonding agents and fusion welding and neural splicing, the sounds, the smells, the perfect, terrible efficiency of it all. And I felt nothing but satisfaction, professional pride in a job well done. The implant wouldn't let me feel anything else, couldn't let me feel anything else, because anything else was interference, was inefficiency, was heresy. Sometimes I wondered if my daughter was out there somewhere, wearing the body they'd rebuilt her into, if she was serving on some distant battlefield or manning some factory station or powering some piece of equipment that required a human nervous system as its processing core. If some remnant of her consciousness remained, trapped and screaming in whatever they'd made her into, but the implant passed those thoughts as irrelevant and deleted them. She was serving, she was useful, she was holy. What more could a father want for his child? I worked Bay 7 for 6 months. Then they promoted me again. Senior oversight, multiple bays under my supervision, training new staff, the ones who still flinched and shook and cried in their bunks, teaching them to count, to verify, to maintain efficiency, preparing them for their own implantations. I was good at it. The implant made me very good at it. I could identify the moment when someone's resistance broke, when they started becoming useful, when they were ready to volunteer for the next stage. I could guide them through their conversion with compassionate efficiency, help them understand that what they were losing wasn't valuable, that humanity was just inefficiency wearing a face. Years passed, the forge complex expanded, new bays opened, new quotas rose, the containers kept arriving, endless river of flesh feeding the machinery of imperial salvation. I rose through the ranks, senior staff, administrative coordinator. Eventually they made me a processing director, overseeing an entire sector, hundreds of bays, thousands of staff, millions of units processed annually. I was everything the preacher with the augmetic jaw had promised. Important, necessary. Serving the God Emperor's holy work in the most direct way possible. I'd achieved salvation through service. I'd become valuable. I'd become efficient. They gave me an office, real walls, temperature control, a proper desk instead of a data slate, a window overlooking the processing sectors where I could watch containers moving through the corridors toward the bays in endless synchronized precision. Beautiful, really. The ultimate expression of imperial logistics. Every component serving its purpose, nothing wasted, nothing irrelevant, just pure, perfect function. I sit here now in this office filing reports and optimizing throughput and training new directors who will oversee new sectors in the endless expansion. My implant keeps my mind clear and focused, keeps me efficient, keeps me from remembering that I used to be someone who would have called this horror, who would have broken at the first container, who would have chosen his daughter over duty. But that person is gone, rendered down and processed just as thoroughly as anything that came through the bays. The Imperium didn't need who I was, it needed what I became, and I volunteered. We all volunteered. That's what the forms say. That's what makes it holy. Sometimes, in the space between one thought and the next, before the implant smooths it away, I wonder if they'll ever run out. If the populations will eventually be exhausted, every hive and settlement and planet picked clean, if the machinery will finally go quiet, if the quotas will be met, and the work will be complete. But I know they won't. The Imperium is vast, and its wars are endless, and its need for flesh is infinite. There will always be more containers, more volunteers, more people standing in hab blocks listening to preachers with augmetic jaws promising salvation through service, more people who think they're too old, too damaged, too invisible to be needed, more people who don't understand what need means until the conversion bay doors seal behind them, more people becoming efficient, more people becoming holy, more people becoming nothing. And I'll be here, in my office with my implant and my perfect focus, maintaining throughput, managing logistics, facilitating the sacred work, counting the seconds, 47 until silence, 3 minutes until the smell. The numbers are prayer, the numbers are purpose, the numbers are all I am. They didn't need volunteers, they needed flesh. But calling it volunteering made the flesh more willing, made it process itself, made it complicit in its own rendering. And that's the real efficiency, that's the real genius. They don't have to hunt us down or force us into the bays. We walk ourselves there, we volunteer, we make ourselves holy. I volunteered, my daughter volunteered. You'll volunteer too when your time comes, when they explain how necessary you are, how valuable, how holy. You'll volunteer because the alternative is admitting your waste, and waste is heretical, and heresy is death, and death is less efficient than transformation. So you'll volunteer, you'll crack the seals, you'll verify the counts, you'll send them forward, you'll count the seconds, and eventually one way or another you'll go through the doors yourself, and 47 seconds later, the screaming will stop. And 3 minutes after that, the smell will come. And something that used to be you will emerge, rendered down and rebuilt, and ready to serve, ready to be efficient, ready to be holy, ready to be nothing at all.